Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. I'm here with Damian Edwards.
Hello.
And we are continuing our introduction to ASP.NET 5. At this portion of the training, it gets really interesting because what we've got for you is an actual live production website that we on the ASP.NET team use basically every week, and you may be using every day. That website is live.asp.net. This is an Azure website that's been written from scratch in ASP.NET 5 by Damian himself. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you what it does, why we wrote it, talk about the problem we were trying to solve, and we're going to do a complete code walkthrough kind of from the beginning.
Yep.
Why did we write this?
So we wrote the site because we host a community stand-up, as it's called, every week, where you and I and John Galloway talk to the world, basically, online via a live stream, and we answer questions for customers. We were tweeting the link every week, and it would be a different link every week because the ID of the particular stream would change. And so the only right way of really knowing when we were going live is that it was watching Twitter and watching Scott's Twitter stream and my Twitter stream, or maybe John's, and hope that you see the tweets sort of go through in the fire hose of information. So a lot of people were missing the live stream as a result. We had pretty good numbers of people watching after the fact, but we wanted to see if we could build up our live viewership. So we figured, why not just create one URL, one website, live.asp.net, where people can go to at roughly the same time every week or alternating from week to week. And then they don't have to worry about finding the particular tweet that says, here's the URL you have to go to watch live now. They can just sit there in the browser, hit F5 at the right time, and the stream starts. So that's what we built.
And originally, when we built this, it was just being streamed on my YouTube, and we may want to move that to a more official thing. Now that it's become popular, it doesn't really belong on my YouTube. We need to build a system that's going to have those archives and allow us to change the links when appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's kind of like a layer of abstraction between the actual content and where people view it from. We were just sending people to youtube.com and Scott's account or to a Hangout link, but we may change technology at some point, so we wanted a landing site that people could go to forever, and all the content would be there.
Now, in previous modules, we made an empty site, and we looked at what empty gave us. We also made a default site without authentication, and we saw how Bootstrap enables us to have responsive sites. Which default template did you use when you made this?
That's a great question. I think I started out with the default sort of website template, and I chose the organizational authentication option during File New, which then sort of took me through the bouncing ball of creating a site that authenticated using Azure AD, because Scott, John, and I can sign into the site with our Microsoft credentials and edit sort of admin settings to the site, but everyone else doesn't need to log in. It's just a public site. So I followed that bouncing ball, and then I just deleted the pages I didn't want. It is quite practically one page for public users. Like, you go to one page and that's it. There's nowhere else to navigate to. So I just deleted the other pages and I started from there.
So let's take a look at what the site looks like.
Okay. So here it is. This is live.asp.net. At the moment, we have set up the date and time for the next live stream. That's one of the settings that we can change via the admin panel, which we'll see a little bit later on. And it's set to 18th of August at some point in time. And then we have a nice little countdown that shows people how long until the next particular show is going to be. There's a facility to add a reminder or add an entry to whatever calendar you're using for when the next show is on, using either iCalendar or downloading an ICS file if you're using Outlook. That works quite well. You can add using the WebCal protocol, which actually creates a subscription from your calendar app. Again, Outlook supports that, as do other calendar apps. And then you can add to Google Calendar, which will redirect you to the Google Calendar site with all the fields pre-populated for the next show. If we scroll down past details for the next show, you can see we have a grid essentially of the previous episodes that were shown. So here's the last episode we did, which was just this week. And then as we scroll through, we can see the thumbnails from all the previous talks. We have a small title for each one, and we'll have a look at how we set that sort of content management up with the title, because we're doing something not clever perhaps, but we tried to ensure that we didn't have to do an awful lot of work on this site. We wanted to reuse the content source as much as possible, and we'll have a look at how we did that. And if we go all the way down to the bottom, we scroll down, then there's a link to see more episodes, which currently takes you to that YouTube playlist. And that's really it. There's a link down to the source code and the issue tracker.
And does it resize? Is it responsive? Does it work on a mobile device?
So if I drag this down, let me just get rid of VS in the background, and I'll get rid of my PowerShell prompt. So we can see that it's gone from 3, there's the 3 here, And if I go to maximize here, change size again. So there's a
did.
couple of breakpoints there, and they're all the default Bootstrap breakpoints. And what I mean by the breakpoint is more of a resize point. So these set points in terms of width in pixels of the current view, not of the screen, but the view you're actually looking it through. I'm currently looking at the largest view, which is around 1100 pixels or so. And if I drop down like that, you can see that the size of these tiles actually shrank. And if I bring it across and we actually do this sort of in live, you'll see that it kind of jumps.
And you did that yourself?
Well, I'm using a lot of the pre-canned components in Bootstrap, and they do that by themselves. So things like this large section at the top is called a jumbotron in Bootstrap, and it knows how to do certain resizing at certain points. These thumbnails, funnily enough, are called thumbnails in Bootstrap. I'm using the thumbnail component, and they have a set size for very large here down to slightly smaller. And then because each one of these is set up as a cell in the Bootstrap grid, they will automatically reflow themselves once they run out of room. So you can see what happened there is, logically from Bootstrap's point of view, this entire list of episodes is actually one row. So this isn't a grid where 3 columns in each row. This is one logical row, and then Bootstrap does all the heavy lifting of flowing the cells across the actual display rows based on the one logical row that I put in my marker.
And people who may be familiar with web development in the past might have said, well, this is a perfect opportunity for a table.
Right.
This is in fact not a table.
This is in fact not a table, and the problem with a table is that it is a fixed grid. Like you say, here's a row, and then here are 3 cells, and here's another row. But with a table, that makes it very difficult to do things like when I get down to this size, I need to flip to 2 across. I just don't have room now to show 3 across with any level of detail. But Bootstrap does this for me automatically because this is all one logical row. It can say, well, I can't fit 3 cells in this row anymore. Even though you want me to put 3 cells in, I will resize them for you automatically into 2. And then that goes all the way down to 1 when you get down to sort of a mobile phone or tablet type of view.
And be sure to note, folks that are watching, is that we actually have an entire, not just a module, but an entire class on using Bootstrap.
Yeah.
So we won't spend too much time looking at Bootstrap, more than what we've seen already, but check out on Microsoft Virtual Academy a complete show on just using Bootstrap. We've just touched the surface of it.
Yeah, and I mean, to be clear, almost all the style in this site is pure Bootstrap. The only things I really changed were I set the base font to match the font we use on the ASP.NET website itself. I think it's Seago UI Lite and Seago UI. And then I'm using like this label here that says new. That's a standard Bootstrap label. These headings are standard Bootstrap headings. I've adjusted like text centering in some places. So I've opted to use the Bootstrap class that will center text in certain areas so I can line it up nicely. And then I've had to tweak things like I need to make sure that these thumbnails are always the same height, because if they're not, if they size based on their content, then you can start having them wrap around each other slightly different ways because of the way a sort of flow layout works in HTML. This type of layout works really well when it's a fixed height. So we did a lot of work to make sure, okay, this will always work as long as we don't have more than 2 lines of text per title. And so that's part of doing layout in web pages is you have to think about the content that's going into the layout and ensure that you don't overflow, because that can actually break your layout depending on how you've done CSS. But everything else is pretty standard. I changed a couple of colors again to match what we use on the style for our main website, and that's it.
So let's do this. We started on our very, very first module looking at an empty site, and we looked at startup.cs.
Okay.
Let's see what startup.cs looks like in a real application.
Sure, let's do that. So here's my application. So here's my stub. You can see I have quite a bit more using statements in this one, although the default website, because we're using auth and things like that, you will see some of these.
Okay.
But here's some of my own namespaces to do with services that I've added, which we'll talk a little bit about later.
All right.
So if we scroll down to my sort of the constructor for my startup class, I'm taking in some constructs that ASP.NET provides for me.
Right.
So this class here, or this interface, gives me information about how I'm being hosted, where is my web folder and that type of thing.
And we did in the previous modules, we talked about configuration builder, and we see here that you've put in an additional JSON file for config. And then the name of an environment.
Yes.
We did a whole module on environments.
Yep.
So does that mean that you have a development.json? And
I actually don't. Now, that's actually there by default in our templates, and I haven't removed it. I haven't had a need to use an environment-specific config file yet, but because this is set as optional, it's just benign right now. Because the file isn't found, it'll never be replaced. What I'm actually using mostly is the user secrets feature to add local secrets that I don't want in my config system. So, for example, you can see we're pulling stuff from YouTube. That requires a YouTube API key. And because we're doing auth with Azure AD, my secrets for Azure AD auth need to be somewhere in the system as well.
So you are in fact using user secrets.
I am actually using user secrets.
Does that mean here, I see that you say if it's the development environment, use user secrets. I assume that's where your secrets are. And then below that, you say add environment variables. I'm assuming that in production, that's where your secrets are.
Yeah, so in the Azure portal for my staging and production sort of environments or slots, I go into the environment variable settings and I add those environment variables so that the names match the config values that my code has been written to look for, so that I can get those values from different places in different environments, but the code is one set of code. Okay. And because these cascade, the later you add them, they have higher precedence because they just knock out any previous values. So if I had a value in my config.json, which I could open up. So for example, I have YouTube application. There's no secrets in here. This stuff is all not security conscious. This is just the ID of the playlist. I have the container name on Azure and the storage blob name. Now note this one is environment specific because I may want to save details in Azure storage, which we do. But I want to be able to run 3 different sort of staging environments at once. I have my local staging, I have my staging in production on Azure, and my actual live site. So I have to use a different file name to store those details, otherwise the different environments would stomp each other. So that is an environment setting, but by default it's in config.json, and then again in production, I have it in an environment variable so that will override what was in config.json.
Gotcha, that makes total sense. And you also have a thing called Application Insights. It's basically an analytical tool that's built into Azure.
Yeah, so this gives me like telemetry information. I can go into the Azure portal and see how many users are currently on the site, how many users I've had historically, and how many sessions versus page views. It also gives me things like exception messages, how responsive my site is, so how long did every request take to execute. And I've even used some extra features, which we'll look at a little bit later, which lets me track the time and frequency of external calls. So every time I call out to Azure Storage and every time I call out to YouTube, I make a special log in Application Insights so that I can see how many times did I call YouTube today and how long did it take me to do that.
Very cool.
So let's scroll down now to the configure services method.
And we talked about the difference between adding a service and using a service. And there's one place where you go and you add them and make them available, like a cafeteria. And then there's the other place where you choose or choose not to use them.
Correct. So in configure services, this is where we're doing the let's add to the menu, to use your cafeteria analogy, right? I need to put a whole bunch of things into the services container. So you'll hear the word container used a lot when we talk about dependency injection or DI and inversion of control or IOC. Those two terms are somewhat interchangeable, but depending on who you talk to, they might get a little technical about what one means versus the other. But I'm going to use them interchangeably. So here I am configuring my container. I am putting services into a container so that later on in my application, I can ask for those services by name or by type again, and they'll be there.
Okay.
So what have I got here? I've got app settings. So I've created a custom class in my application called app settings, which I can feed values into from configuration.
Okay, cool. So when Glenn and I did this, we called ours, as I recall, just options or my options.
Yep.
So you call it whatever you want to.
You can call it whatever you like. And I called it app settings because in previous versions of .NET, we had a feature called app settings, and it's kind of a thing that we know about. But the long story short there is that later on in my app, if I want to get one of these settings, I don't have to deal with the configuration system again. I only do that during startup. I just ask for my app settings and I get them as strongly typed sort of properties, which is kind of nice.
Got it.
Then I go off and start configuring some of the external things that I'm using in my app. So this one authenticates the ability to authorize people with cookies. That's one of the default things that's in there as well. Then I go and configure the Azure AD authentication that we talked about briefly. So that uses a standard called OpenID Connect, or OIC, and that is the ability for a authentication server or service, in this case Azure Active Directory, to provide authentication or federated authentication services for my application.
Right.
Federated simply means I'm going to let you do the authentication for me, and then you're going to give that back to me at some point, and then I'm going to trust what you gave me and just treat that as if I had authenticated the user myself.
Okay.
So this is a whole bunch of settings required to make that work. And you can see here, there's an example of some secrets. Now, the secrets aren't in this code, they're being referred to in this code, but they will be pulled out by the configuration. So in this case, my client ID is one of those secret parts that I share with Azure, and only me and Azure know about that. But I have to put it in the code here so that when this code runs later on, it can talk to Azure using that ID. That ID is not anywhere in this source tree right now. So that's being pulled from the ether by my configuration settings that we saw up here before.
From any one of those places.
From any one of those
cascading.
places, correct.
Okay.
So that's OpenID Connect. Then I configure authorization. So this step is to do with authentication. Authentication is determining who somebody is. I determine that you are Scott Hanselman, and I trust that you are Scott Hanselman. Then I decide, well, what can Scott Hanselman do? That's authorization. In this case, I have created a policy in my application called admin. There's really only two roles in my application. There are people who come to look at live.asp.net,
right.
And there is you, me, and John, who go and edit sort of the admin screen to change data. I've created a policy called admin, and basically you have to be either you, me, or John to be in the admin group. As simple as that. And this is the code I had to do that. You get a policy builder. This is using a new, it's not new, but somewhat new concept. We haven't had this in ASP.NET forever, called claims-based policy.
Yeah.
And so basically the idea is that when the authentication has occurred, so this step up here, Azure sends me back a token that says, hey, this is Scott Hanselman. Along with that will come a bunch of claims. One of those claims is the name that you go by on that service. So
I see, the name, in fact, that I claim.
The name, in fact, that you claim. And so you can hear, this is the full name of that claim. So these are standards-based. That's why it has a long scheme. It's a URL that is public, that everyone can look at. We all agree that this is the thing that says, this is who you are.
And this isn't a Microsoft thing.
No.
This is just a thing. It's a web thing.
This is just a web thing.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I'm saying, I require that this claim is equal to one of these values that, again, is in my configuration system.
Okay.
And that one isn't particularly secret. It's you, me, or John. And so I just pass those values directly into there, and then I can use that later on in my application.
That seems like a pretty simple thing that means that you don't necessarily have to have a database of users. You didn't have to really think about it from a security perspective. People log in to the thing that they know how to log in already.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just log into work.
That's a great point. Like, I didn't have to create user accounts and passwords for this site. You and I log in with our Microsoft, credentials. Like I log in with the same username and password, and two-factor or three-factor authentication systems I use to log in to Microsoft, and you do the same thing because we're leveraging Azure AD to do that. There is no code in my application to deal with usernames or passwords, other than here saying, hey, if you want to be an admin, your username must be this.
Interesting. So could you also have theoretically used Twitter as the authoritative source?
I could have
used Facebook, and I would just log into my Microsoft account.
Absolutely. So we have, when you go through the file new process, if you choose the individual accounts option rather than the organizational accounts option, then we will emit code into the project that lets you do exactly what you said. I can authenticate users using Twitter, Google account, Microsoft account, Facebook account, those type of things. Okay, if we move down here a little bit more, here are the services required for application insights, which was the telemetry service we briefly spoke about when we looked at the configuration section.
Right, this is similar to Google Analytics.
Similar to Google Analytics. It does client-side analytics like Google, but it also does server-side .NET specific analytics as well.
Cool.
Then I I add the services required to run MVC because I need to run MVC in my application.
And we'll come back and talk about that calendar output one. That's kind of an advanced feature. Probably talk about in the next module. But I see that you add MVC because you are an MVC application.
I am an MVC application. And then I get down to my services. So all the services I've been configuring so far, if we scroll back up to here, other than the app settings, these are all just to configure other parts of the ASP.NET framework, or application insights, other things that I had pulled in. Now, if we come back down here, I'm adding my own services. So these are things that I wrote in my application, and I'm using the dependency injection features so that I don't have to take direct dependencies on those types in my code. That makes the code more testable. It makes it easier to configure different things to use in different environments. And actually, we can see that right here. I have an example of if I have a configuration value set that is the Azure Storage Connection string, then I add a service that implements iLive Show Detail service. I'm sorry, if I don't have one, there's a
if this is null. So what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is you're saying this is an indirect way of saying if I'm in production or if I'm, but you're not actually saying if in production or not. You're saying if I have a connection string that lets me talk to the cloud, use this. Otherwise, I must be at work. I must be on my regular local machine.
Right. So I'm kind of doing, it's kind of the difference between doing browser sniffing and feature detection. So I could have said, if I'm in production, always use Azure Storage, or if I'm in development, always use file-based storage. But I might want to be doing local development and test the code against Azure Storage. And so I'm doing this more like saying, well, if I have a configuration setting present that would let me talk to Azure Storage, use it.
Right.
If I don't, fall back to using one that just talks to the file system. Okay? So there's a nice little bit of indirection there that lets me test one or the other quite easily.
And that's a pattern that people can use all throughout. I mean, you can say, if this is available, use it. If it's not, here are some alternatives.
Absolutely, yep. And you can see they both implement the same contract, and that's the contract the rest of my code actually deals with. Nothing talks directly to these types. They talk through this interface, and those two types implement that interface.
So then that means, if I may, theoretically, if you look at line 81 there, if there was something in the future other than YouTube, if we decided to move this to channel 9,
Correct.
or some other, or Vimeo, we could make a Vimeo show service that would implement iShow service.
Absolutely, and then the only thing I would have to do is, as you said, create the Vimeo show service and then change this line to inject that instead of the YouTube service. None of my other code would have to change.
I see, so that the container you're passing around is filled with this this and that, these interfaces, these agreements, not with the actual YouTube this or the Azure that. So the person downstream, the component downstream, doesn't really have to care about YouTube.
Correct. They just have to care about the contract of iShow service. And if we have a quick look at that, we can see what that actually means. This has one method on it.
It shows.
Get recorded shows async. It takes a user and whether cache is disabled and returns those shows. It's really that simple.
Very cool.
That's all they have to care about.
And we're going to go into this kind of stuff in detail in a future MVA on advanced ASP.NET 5.
Awesome. So that's the end of my services configuration. So after that method has been called, the container is actually built. All this stuff is just setting up the container. Then it is built, and then that container is used forevermore through the life of this application. Then we get down to the configure method, which is where we determine what's actually going to deal with handling HTTP requests for this application. We call this building the HTTP pipeline. So I'm assuming you talked about HTTP in one of the earlier modules, or for those who don't know, this is just the protocol that your web browser and the web server use to talk to each other. And so I now, in this method, determine what methods are going to run when web requests come into my server. It's really as simple as that.
Okay.
Now, I can take in dependencies here as well. So this is that dependency injection feature being used once more. I'm bringing in the iApplication Builder, which is the type I use to build up that pipeline.
Right.
And I'm bringing in more information about my hosting environment. This is how I determine if I'm in production or in development. And then I have this third one, which is a logger factory. And this is a type that we use to do logging in our application. How do I log out to a text file, or log out to a database, or log out to the console? That's added by default in the templates, and by default it adds a console logger so that when you run this application from a command line, you can see log messages come out into the command line, which is kind of useful. So what do we do here? So if I'm in production, I'm going to say, please use the Application Insights request telemetry. So if I'm running in production on Azure, I want Application Insights to be in my pipeline so that it can do things like time how long every request took and count how many requests were hit on my server. So I do that first so that it can monitor everything that comes after this.
Is it really common to have things like is production, is development, is production, is development? Like, is that something that you really have to be aware of when you are writing a production website?
I think that really depends. I mean, this is a fairly new feature in ASP.NET, this idea of environmental awareness. And as we move to doing local development and then rapidly deploying to the cloud, there are always environmental differences. There are some things that I generally don't want to run locally that I do want to run in production, and vice versa. So for things like Application Insights telemetry, I don't want my telemetry data for my live site to be, to include information about me running on my local development machine. So I don't add that telemetry information while I'm running locally. I only do that when I'm running in production. Similarly, for the error page, which is the next line down here, I want to show a different type of error page when I'm running locally. This is a developer error page. This one has information on it that I wouldn't want to show publicly. It has the contents of all environment variables. It has like the stack trace that caused the error, that type of stuff.
It's that light blue screen of death. It used to be the yellow screen of death.
Yes.
Now it's a much friendlier one.
It's a much friendlier one. This one, the error handler, is meant to be the friendly error page. This is where you send customers or visitors to your site when something went wrong in the pipeline. Okay?
You do have a friendly error page?
I have the default friendly error page. That just has a big red text that says, something went wrong, I'm sorry.
Very cool. But of course, because you're using telemetry, that would be picked up
Yes.
by application insights.
Actually, and I check that every couple of days, and I can see whether any errors have been thrown. And once that happens, I can actually get a stack trace from that error log from application insights, and then I can hopefully from that stack trace determine what the problem was.
Yep.
So there's the, also from production, we add another application insights sort of telemetry point. So this one here, request telemetry is to do with timing your request. The exception telemetry is to do with catching those exceptions so that you can report them in application insights. The order you put those in the pipeline is important. The order of all the methods in this pipeline building is important because when a request comes in, they're going to run through these steps in the pipeline in the same order that you run them.
Does that mean that this function, this method here, runs every single time?
No. So this method runs once to build the pipeline. So what this does is when you call use application insights, use error page, that adds a function or a delegate to a list of delegates that will be run every time a request comes through. So that part runs every time.
Okay, so configure is a description of the pipeline.
Correct.
It is a programmatic description of the pipeline, and now the pipeline exists, and then you use that now existing pipeline.
Absolutely. So the order you put them in is important because any one of these delegates or stages in the pipeline can choose whether it's going to run the next one.
Right.
So you can short circuit the pipeline. So I could come down to, for example, use static files. If a request comes in to serve a static file, like my favicon.ico file, for example, the icon that shows in the toolbar of a browser, this function that's added, the function added by this function, will handle that request. And then everything after that won't run for that specific request. So the order you put them in here is important. So after static files, I use cookie authentication, then I use OpenID Connect authentication. These are the stages in the pipeline that will do things like authenticate the user. So if you have these, the lower you put these down, the more things will run without someone being authenticated. This is pretty much the default order. Then I added this one here. I added this one just yesterday. This is an inline method that will run on every request. And
that does happen every single time.
This
What's inside from line 123 to line...
That part.
Exactly.
So this is me passing an anonymous function, otherwise called a lambda, into the method app.use, and it adds that function to the pipeline. So that every time the request comes in, I get a context parameter, which is HTTP context, and I get next, which is the next function in the pipeline.
So in the original, very, very first module, we had an app use, and we just said hello world here.
Right.
And we didn't delegate to the next one.
Correct.
And we grabbed everything coming in. Here you're saying look for ping.
Yes.
But we didn't even have that.
Right.
So then if we put something after that, it never ever...
Yeah, so your middleware, these things are called middleware, by the way. So we have a pipeline, they're full of functions, and the functions are otherwise called middleware because they tend to sit in between the start of the request and the actual thing that will handle your request. And requests flow through the middleware. This piece here, if I don't call next, it's terminal. Once it runs, the request is done.
Got it.
Okay. Now I choose here, I say if it ends in ping, then I will finish. I return from this function the result of calling pong on the response, which means I don't call next, which means MVC won't run because it's after me. Okay. So this reads very linearly. So as you said before, as long as you can get the concept of this method runs to configure the pipeline, and I put them in a certain order, and then when requests actually run, there's the output of this method is what will run every single time for every single request. And then finally, we actually use MVC. So if nothing else handled the request, then it'll fall through to what we actually will be using the majority of the time, which is MVC.
And that would be the routing in MVC, the routing in
Routing,
MVC.
Controllers, views, all those type of things.
All right.
Yeah. So that's my startup class.
Okay. So with the layout, the larger layout, did you do anything with that? That's just, we saw that layout uses Bootstrap. It includes some JavaScript. Did you have to add any of your own in the larger layout?
Yeah, I did a little bit. So let me go and drill into my view down here. Shared, here's my layout page. So the layout page is somewhat the same as the default, and then I've added a few extra things here. So if you've looked at the default layout page, you'll note that we have these environment tags that will add links to things like style sheets and JavaScript files that point to different places for production versus development. So those things are all still here. But you'll also note that I've got a couple of extra things here, like a partial tag, which I'll talk about a little later, where I'm rendering a partial named analytics head and one called analytics bodies after the body. Then I have declarations of different sections. Now, by default, the templates that we have a body, so everything has a body, right? That's the actual page that you're rendering. The layout page is the one that's shared across multiple pages.
Okay.
And then we have a section down the bottom called scripts. And this is where any given page can add extra JavaScript references if they need it.
I see. So when our thing, we had those scripts just in line there.
Right.
But I'm hearing you say that yours got to be kind of unruly, or you just want to see them anymore, so you move them away so you don't have to look at them, but also so you can reuse them.
It's so that a specific page can sort of specify its own scripts, because you don't always use the same scripts on every page. So if you know on your site that you always use jQuery and Angular or whatever it might be, you can just put those directly in line here. But perhaps certain pages require you to use a different jQuery plugin or a different Bootstrap plugin. And so you don't want to have that in your layout page so it's loaded for every single page.
Right.
You might only want to have that on the pages where you use those scripts. And so you would do that by putting a reference to those scripts in a scripts section, and then the layout page, as we can see here, is going to render that script section if it exists.
Gotcha.
So I added two other layout sections. I added a pre-content section and a post-content section. And this is so that any of my content pages can choose to put HTML in slightly different parts of the page. Because you can see here that I have, on line 29, I have a container element, which is part of Bootstrap again, which sort of holds the root of my content. This is where my rows and columns and things in the grid will go.
I see.
And then I render out the body of the page. Then I have the page footer, which is always at the bottom. But what if I need to put something before the container, or I need to put something after the container? There are going to be special cases where a content page might need to do that. So I've added these two sections so that I have that flexibility. Other than that, the layout page is pretty straightforward. I have a bunch of hard-coded links off to our privacy statement, terms of use, a link to the GitHub for the source code and the issue tracker, and that's pretty much it.
That seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
And again, you're using straight Bootstrap.
Yes.
Didn't have to worry about any of those things.
Yep.
Can we see the partial that had those scripts?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go and have a look at my home page. I'm going to drop into my home folder and open the index. And I'll go full screen again. So we can see here straight away that I'm doing something in the pre-content section on the home page.
Okay.
So the Jumbotron has to be outside of the main container.
The Jumbotron is the large,
text
wide text at the top.
So that's one of the components that comes with Bootstrap. And I wanted my home page to use that Jumbotron element, so I needed to be able to put that before the main container. So I'm using that pre-content section here.
Okay.
And if I scroll down, we'll see that once I get past the Jumbotron, then I have everything after that will go into the body of the page. Go into where I called render body, everything after that will show up in that render body section. And if I go all the way to the bottom, you'll see that I now have my script section, and this is this page stating these are the scripts required for this page to run. Now, this application is very simple. It actually only has two pages. It has the home page that public users, and it has an admin screen, which we'll look at a little later, and it has slightly different scripts because it has to do different things. I probably could have chosen to put jQuery on the layout page if I wanted to, because I use them in both places.
Makes sense.
But this, in this case, I like to be very specific. I know the home page requires these scripts, so I put them in the home page like this.
Does the admin page have custom JavaScript?
It does, actually.
And we'll look more at the admin page a little bit later. But
So if I just open the admin page now and I scroll down, the admin page...
let me guess. Does the admin page have any validation JavaScript?
It does have some validation
It's
JavaScript.
where the form fields are.
That's correct. So you can see here I've got a call to render a partial called validation scripts. And I've actually sort of factored the references out to those scripts into a separate partial. We actually do that by default in our templates now, because there are, I think it's 2 or 3 extra scripts you need to do that. And you only need those on pages where you have forms, where you're doing client-side validation. So I don't have that on the home page, because why force people to download the scripts if we're not going to use them? And then I actually have a block of JavaScript. You can see here I've actually got a hard block of JavaScript inside at the end of this page, which is to do a little feature that I have on the admin page, which is if you're looking at the admin page, it doesn't show secrets by default. You have to click on the secret things in order to see them, so that we can do lessons like this, and I can show you stuff without having to show you all my secrets.
Exactly.
Which is kind of nice.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay, so that was we got a layout page where the common stuff is, and then I've got 2 content pages in this application, one for the public and then one for the admin screen. Shall we drill in a little bit more into some of the elements that make up the home page?
Right, because the home page is full of data that is coming from somewhere.
Right.
And we just talked to Rowan, who showed us how we could use Entity Framework, which talks to a database, but certainly people can talk to web services or other websites. You can make data and present it to another website, or in this case, we're using YouTube as our database.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So if I go and have a look at let's go and have a look at my controller. So here's my home controller. So let's look at the code that actually runs before the view renders. So here's my home controller. In its constructor, I take in a couple of those services that I set up in my startup class in the configure services method. So there's my shows service, which gives me information about previous shows. And here's the live show details service, which gives me information about either the next live show or the current live show that's on right now.
Right. Now, the state of this site is that it is either a show is coming soon or a show is happening right now.
Right now, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and you can always see the previous shows after that. And so then here's my index method. So on the home controller index method, this is the one that will run when anyone goes to the root of the site. That's fairly obvious because I have this route attribute right above it that is configured just to /, which means the root of my site routes to this index method on this controller. So what do I do in here? I load the details for the current live show or the future live show.
Yep.
I then get the previous recorded shows from the show service.
Right.
And then once I have those 2 things, I return a view and I pass into that view a home view model. And this is a class that exists in my application that allows me to pass data from the controller into the view so that I can render it using Razor in a strongly typed fashion.
Right.
And the home view model has an admin message, which is something that you and I can set so that it shows up on the home page if we're preparing to get a show ready. It has the show date and time of the next live show. It has the embed URL. If we're currently doing a show right now, there will be a URL that has where you watch that show. It has the list of previous shows, and then it has the link to get more shows, which was that button at the bottom of the list that said, hey, click here to get more. And that's it. That is all the logic in my action for the controller.
So you have this thing called a view model. We talked very briefly about this. You go and you pull your data out of whatever you pull your data out of. In this case, you're pulling it out of YouTube. You could put it out of a database. You could you not just taken those live show details and passed that right into the view?
Yeah, if my homepage was sort of one element simpler, if I didn't have to worry about a live show and I only had to worry about the previous shows, I could just pass that show list directly through to the page as its model, and then it would just enumerate over those shows and show them. But because I kind of have 2 distinct types of data, I have previous shows and then I have everything to do with the current show, which is the admin message, the next show date, the live show embed URL. I created a type that aggregates that data together in one nice class, and then I put helper properties on that class to make it very easy to determine in my view, hey, is there a live show on right now?
Right.
I don't have to set that explicitly because I can infer that if we drop into my home view model. You can see I have things like is on air.
Is on air. If it doesn't have an admin message and it does have a live show embed URL, then that is on air.
I am on air.
It's a calculated property.
It's a calculated property. And this avoids me having to do this type of logic in the view itself, embedded in HTML. That's generally not a great idea because every time you have to start do expressions like this, this is basically business logic. This is a determination of what state the site is currently in. I don't really want that type of information in my view because frankly it's harder to maintain in there.
Right.
You can't test it in there, it's harder to find it and change it. It may have to be repeated in multiple sections of the view.
Right.
Because it's not always, I might have different elements that show up whether I'm on air or not, and they may not be right next to each other.
So writing, if it doesn't have admin message and it has live, doing that over and over again, or really even doing it at all in a view would be considered poor practice.
Yeah, I tend to think so. And you see this pattern very commonly in rich client applications that use something like model view, view model, rather than model view controller. And they have a view model class, which looks an awful lot like this, and they will have a lot of these helper properties because they work well with data binding systems. Now, we don't have data binding in Razor as such, but if you look at the actual markup here, I'm accessing a model in a strongly typed fashion which contains data. So you can kind of argue then, down here I'm even putting it directly inside of an HTML attribute. So if you kind of squint, it looks a lot like data binding as we would traditionally call it in other applications. And as I said, I like to avoid doing complex expressions in my markup. I'd much prefer to do that in C# where it makes a lot of sense, and then just refer to simple properties throughout my HTML.
That's nice. So you say, I want to return this new view model, and then you pass in your things, and then say a little something about that question mark dot. That's a new C# feature that's very tidy.
So this is basically the null traversal operator. And so what does that mean? So the dot is the traversal operator. This is how you say, I want to get something from the live show details object called admin message. So I traverse through an object graph. The live show details is an object. It has a property called admin message, and it could have its own properties. I could put a dot on the end of that again. You can see I have more methods that I can call. So I traverse from one object to the other using that dot. But if live show details is null, you can't traverse. Like if I tried to do live show details dot admin message and live show details was empty or null because we don't have any live show details yet, that would give me an error. I would get a null reference error, and you would get the common error message, which is like object reference is not set to an instance of an object, right? This is an object reference right here. So this character lets me say safely, please give me the value of admin message if live show details is not null. If it is null, don't bother trying to get that, just return null.
And then admin message would end up being null. And then you have to deal with it later.
And then I have to deal with null. Now a null check is very easy, and it makes a lot of sense in a Razor page. It's very easy to rationalize about, if this is null, show something. If it isn't, show it, or vice versa. So I don't mind using null to represent the absence of data because that's what null means. So you'll see a lot of places in my code, like load async can return null. If I don't have any live show details, I'll just return null from that method, and my code is set up to deal with those nulls in an appropriate fashion.
Very cool. So you call get recorded shows async, which is making an HTTP call over to YouTube.
Correct.
Okay, let's take a look at where that data comes from.
Absolutely. So if I go over to my services folder, this is where, now services in this context doesn't mean web services. It just means classes in my application that are called by other parts of the application. They provide a service.
They provide a service to yourself.
Right. Now, if you have very simple applications, you might find that you just end up putting a lot of logic in the controller itself. And we have a name for that. It's called fat controllers.
Is it really?
Yes. And depending on the type of application and who's looking after it, that might be perfectly fine. If you don't need this level of abstraction or this level of componentization, there's nothing wrong with doing that if you understand what you're doing. This code is open source, which means lots of eyes are going to be looking at it and potentially lots of people are going to be changing it.
Right.
And I like this separation of concerns because it makes this method very simple. The index method does exactly two things. It gets data from services and it puts that data in a model that can be used by the view. And that's all it ever does.
So this is a thin controller.
It's a thin controller.
So does that mean that when one is creating a controller with model view controller, that they should focus on having the controller be more of a facilitator?
It's an orchestrator.
An orchestrator between different services.
Yes.
In this case, between two services and the view.
Absolutely. And when you start taking in data from the client, they will naturally get a little bit larger because I'll start taking in, like on the admin screen, which we'll look in later, you're accepting a form. It's not just a GET request. You're actually getting data from the customer, and you have to do things like model binding in here, validate the model is valid before you then go and call your service, for example.
In our second or third module, we talked about view bags, and we had a model that we would get back from the user, and we would turn around and put it into the view, and then we had a little message that we were passing along.
Right.
We put that in a view bag.
Yep.
Why aren't you using view bags here?
So view bag is really, how do you explain what a view bag is? So
we just said it was a bag of stuff.
It's a bag of stuff. It's an untyped bag of stuff.
Keyed by strings.
It's keyed by strings. So a view model is sort of the more structured way to do something like that, to pass data from the controller to the view. A view bag allows you to do it without any structure. It's just one property called view bag. You put something in it, you give it a name but with a string, and it's an object. So the other side has to know what type it is. For example, there's no typing in there because you can put anything in the view bag. But it's also useful for cases where you have to pass stuff between the content and the layout page, because the layout page doesn't have access to your model. Only the content page has access to the model. And so you'll actually see that. I'll show you where I am using view bag. If I flip back over to the layout page, I scroll up to the top. See here?
Oh, just for little things. The title.
The title.
That way the title isn't in every single one of your
Correct.
view models.
And of course the layout page, I can't set the title in the layout page because it's shared by everyone. I want the page itself to set that. So if I go to the top of the index, scroll back to the top here, you'll see that the title for this page is actually set directly in the view. Now, I could set the title from the model and then just use the view data or the view bag to pass the title from this view to the layout. If that makes sense. I could actually not put it in there. No, I'm not actually setting it from the controller. In this application, I'm not setting anything on view data from controller. I'm only using it to pass information from this view to the layout. And I could do the same thing with a partial, for example, which we'll look at a little bit later on as well.
Okay, so we'll take a break right here.
Yep.
And in the next module, we will look into how that data comes back from YouTube and how he made that connection, and then a little bit more detail into filling up that view from the view model and displaying the data.
Great.